Hello, elephants in the room, and welcome to the third episode of the European University Institute Equity, Diversity and Inclusion podcast, where we explore how different factors such as gender and gender identity, sex, race, ethnicity, class, sexual orientation, religion or belief, disability, weight, affect every part of our society, from our places of work to politics, from culture to history, food and everything in between. We will also reflect together with our guests on the intersectionality of these factors, both within the same under-recognized groups presenting these characteristics and in the wider society. This podcast makes all of us part of the conversation because we are all part of the story. As you may know from previous episodes, my name is Giuseppe, I'm the Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Officer at the EUI, and this episode of our podcast will be online during Pride Month. With our guests, we will talk about the meaning and history of Pride, and in what ways its evolution since the Stonewall riots has reflected the changes in the LGBTQIA+ community and how it is perceived by societies. For this episode, we have not one but two guests in conversation with each other, so it's a new format. We are very happy to have here with us Professor Benno Gammerl and Monica Morado, a PhD researcher at the EUI. Benno is a professor of history of gender and sexuality. His diversity and difference, exclusion and participation are themes that inform his research. He engages with post-colonial and feminist theories, queer approaches, oral history methods, and the history of emotions. He puts the voices of those people center stage who face discrimination and who strive for justice and recognition. Monica is a PhD researcher at the Department of History and Civilization, researching non-normative and ambiguous gender and identity in early modern Spain. Among her studies, she focused on gender and the lived body in early modern hermaphroditism. Monica, Benno, welcome to the show, and we are very happy to have you here today with us.
Hi, good morning. Our pleasure.
Hi, thank you very much for inviting us.
Before delving into the history of Pride and the meaning of Pride today for the LGBTQIA+ community, I thought it would be interesting to talk with you a little bit more about your research field. Your research concerns the history of emotions and queer history. So I think it would be interesting for our listeners to know a little bit more about what it means to look at history from the perspective of queerness and emotions. And if you can tell us about what queering history as an action brings to the surface.
Do you want to start or shall I, Monica?
Please, go ahead.
I think we're going to talk more about the emotions when we talk kind of about pride, because kind of that is in a way emotion. Maybe we also talk about love, hate, all those things. But kind of queering history, I think for me, first of all, is kind of thinking about identities and how they change and vary across time. You know, there's always kind of a danger to assume people kind of have always self-identified and thought of themselves as we do today, as kind of gay, LGBT, non-binary, trans people. But that's not the case, right? So these things change across time, and it's interesting for historians to kind of have a conversation with the past across those differences. So I think that's one of the important and challenging, but also kind of inspiring things about queer history. Second thing for me is the complexity of developments. So there's always an assumption or a danger to assume things are getting better. It gets better was kind of a famous online project, but that's unfortunately not the case. Right, there's always contradictory dynamics, developments that happen simultaneously. Just think about today, right? There is achievements, things that are won, that kind of rights that are won and things like that, but there is also renewed hostility. There is right-wing parties celebrating electoral victories, homo and transphobic agendas. And there is also what you could describe as normalization of sexual and gender diversity. So all kind of contradictory things happening at the same time. And I think looking at queer history helps us understanding that. And the final point, I think, is the close connection between research and activism. And I think that's also something we'll talk more about. But I think that's kind of a specificity of queer history. That connection is particularly obvious, right? You don't just do research for research's sake. There is always question of politics as well.
Yeah, there's not much more to add. It's a wonderful description of what queering history and queer history mean. I think, at least from my perspective, it's just a very stimulating thing to do. And I think it brings progress also the discipline of history further in terms that other aspects don't, because it's something that is intrinsically self-critical. So it's just basically being critical about the way we understand identity, the way we understand time, the way we understand sources and methods. So for the historical discipline, I think it's something that can be very enriching and also can help us dust off the historical shelves, and in terms of being multidisciplinary, opening up historical research to activism. So I think it just makes us question many, many things in very interesting ways, and it's very stimulating also as research.
I mean, there's also kind of something we sometimes forget because it's so obvious for us, but kind of bringing the voices of queer people to history, right? Because they have for a very long time not been included in classic
narratives,
works of history.
Sure. I really like this concept of a conversation with the past and being critical about our identities in terms of LGBTQIA+. And I think this brings us to the origin of Pride as it's conventionally intended and meant by the community, that is the Stonewall riots. So maybe it could be useful for our listeners to have a little bit of a refresh of what the Stonewall riots were before we discuss it a little bit more in depth.
Take it away, Monica.
Well,
easy question.
Well, we all know it's a riot just started when there was police raids on the Stonewall Inn in New York in 1969, and that kind of sparked a moment of outrage within the LGBTQI+ community. Around that time, I think they had been going through a lot of stuff that without posing collective, organized resistance, and I think that police raid was the drop that made the glass pour, and then it sparked a lot of many days of protest and collective action, and that in turn was then further on materialized in the creation of organizations that actually continued these struggles in time, and they really contributed to a lot of progress in terms of LGBTQI+ rights in that period, especially in the US, but then of course it then influenced other places, starting by the UK, that was also, as far as I know, very collaborated in those initial riots, so it kind of infiltrated Europe. And eventually, I think only 1 year later, they celebrated the first, what was then called parade, not really a pride celebration, but just more like a parade to commemorate what had happened. And then that kind of later took on that form of like one yearly parade called Pride, in which these things would be vindicated, celebrated, but also vindicated all around the world. And then I think it's more than 200 countries celebrate Pride today. So it's I don't know, it's one of those moments where we have like one specific point in history that, to which you can pinpoint certain things that came after, which of course doesn't mean that everything began with that riot, but it's very relevant.
To really understand it, one also has to kind of try to think of what was before, right? So there is if this happens in a climate of fear, people were arrested, police harassment was an everyday experience for a lot of queer people. And then to take the courage to scream and fight back, that was quite something. And as Monica said, it's also important to remember that it was actually not necessarily the first. There's the Compton cafeteria riot that happens before. There's other events that are important in European countries. For example, Italy has the San Remo event in 71. Germany that has the first gay and lesbian demonstration in 72 in Münster. And actually it took a while before it became clear that the Stonewall riot would be that moment that marks this shift from hiding to fighting back and becoming publicly visible. And I think it's also took a while before it came to be, as you said, before it came to be called Pride. And I think it's interesting and important to remember that those first demonstrations were no celebrations. I mean, I did oral history interviews and people talked about in the 1970s how they were spat at, how people made all kinds of derogatory comments, and still today there is violence. Last year in Germany, a trans person was murdered at a Pride parade. So I think it's important to remember the complexity of that history.
Yeah, and I think it's also interesting, and I think we will talk about it later, about the intersectional elements, Pride and becoming more visible in terms of LGBTQIA+ community, and the fact that these movements also crossed with other social movements that were happening in the US, but also globally, as you were saying before, Benno, in Italy was linked with the medicalization of homosexuality and criminalization of it. I Also wanted to touch upon something you said about this being a moment of resistance, and that Stonewall wasn't necessarily the first protest, but it's the one that's remembered more. But I think, if I'm not wrong, for instance, the episode that the cafeteria in San Francisco revolved around, more specifically, trans women. I think it's interesting to see also within the LGBTQIA plus community how certain groups or certain persons within the community have been somehow erased or forgotten through the years in favor of other more visible groups for various reasons, let's say heteronormativity, masculinity, and so on and so forth. So would you like to say something about these groups, about the fact that, for example, trans people, non-binary people, queer people of color have been somehow overshadowed and over the years, and now we see maybe a sort of a later belated recognition of their efforts and their importance for the movement?
I just add kind of for the San Francisco event, I mean, as you say, trans women, sex workers, homeless people. If you think of Stonewall, you have Marsha P. Thompson and Sylvia Rivera, now kind of are acknowledged, but for a while, for a long while, too long a while, groups have been forgotten, almost kind of sidelined. And it was very much a white gay thing. But I mean, I don't know, Monica, what's your view on that, memory politics?
I think that now is, thankfully, I think the trans movement and trans inclusivity within the feminist movement and within the LGBTQI plus movements is, I think, one of the most important, relevant, and interesting and thrilling political movements of our time. And I think that is rightly so, because they've been, occupying those, as Benno was saying, that the last step in that ladder, and now we're reclaiming figures that were important in Stonewall and that have been important in like these very relevant and milestones in queer history, and that are trying to slowly, I think, undermine that somehow the idea that had been revolving around Pride, that it was just the white gay celebration. And I think putting inclusivity in the table, also talking about intersectional experience of non-white trans folks, and also like different degrees of ability, different degrees of like class. Also, it's been like a super important element that is being talked about more and more. I think these are coming a bit late, and sadly, in many cases, not really impulsed by and boosted by a lot of people, but especially by collectives of trans people that are like doing a lot of interesting and wonderful work for trying to put those conversations on the table. And I'm really glad that a lot of people are listening, but I think that the problems of acceptance and even discrimination, not only outside of the feminist and queer movement, but also within those movements, which is sometimes, especially in terms of activism or academia, is just very, very problematic. And I guess it's a good call to action in moments like this and Pride, where that reminds us that there's still a lot to be done. So there's a lot to celebrate, but also a lot to be done.
I think that's one of the reasons why it's so important to, some people then use that catchword intersectionality, but to think about cis heteronormativity and racism, ableism, ageism, how they interact and how it hangs together. And also this, what you said about horizontal hostility, how kind of sometimes gay white groups have kind of been involved in the marginalization of black people, trans people, sex workers, kind of less respectful groups. And I think what is also interesting, there is a whole history about Pride and Stonewall, but I think also the memory of HIV and AIDS activism, that changes a lot. If you think of public history, you're also thinking about television. There, I think kind of from the beginning, there has been a more diverse memory politics, because it's so obvious that AIDS, HIV kind of was very much dependent what social position you had, to which extent you were affected by the pandemic. Also kind of the activism was very broad, very diverse. Actually quite happy to see that in this case, kind of the memory is kind of trying to catch up with that necessity to also remember the diversity and the different positions from which people struggled to survive in the 1980s.
Do you think that in terms of HIV was definitely a turning point for the LGBTQIA plus community, and not only for us as a community, but do you think that the memory preserved today, and or do you think, on the other hand, that there is a tendency to forget these moments in time? For instance, within the LGBTQIA plus community, I imagine you will say it's complex, but I don't know if you can say a little bit more about that.
That's what historians always say, right? But I would say it's not only preserved, it's lived. In the terms of HIV and AIDS activism, it's really, I think, a lot of activists take inspiration from also the activist protest strategies and tactics that have been developed in the 80s and 90s. I think in that respect, it's living memory very much, I would say.
I mean, HIV/AIDS activism is not something that is in the past. It's still very much alive, even if we consider, that's a part of like the 90s and the big, epidemics. Now it's still something that still should be on the table. Still, a lot of people are doing a lot of super interesting activism about it, and there's still discrimination as well. So it's important to be inspired by those movements, but also acknowledge that they're still very much alive, and that it is also important to contribute to them today, I think.
This makes me think about what you were saying before about the fact that Pride started as a violent act, actually, not of course more on the part of the police, but of course there were violent moments. There was hate, and it wasn't really a moment of joy, right? And this makes me think about how Pride even today is not a moment of joy everywhere or in all countries, and even in countries where it's supposed to be like that. Benno, you were saying before there were episodes of a trans person was killed, and so I think we are seeing this complexity again around Pride and around LGBTQIA+ more generally. So we see trends towards more progress, even in terms of legislation or recognition, for example, of same-sex partnerships on one hand, but on the other hand, we see that more and more laws are passed that prevent people from, and LGBTQIA+ people from gathering and exercising their freedom of assembly and even celebrating Pride. So I was wondering if you have something to say about it, and if you think that, in a way, Pride is a moment that can help us reflecting on these different aspects of being an LGBTQIA+ person. I always miss one letter in the acronym, but what's the meaning of being an LGBTQIA+ person as an individual, but also in society when you are public, you express it publicly?
Well, it's a lot. There's a lot of things that come to my mind, actually, because maybe just focusing on the idea of Pride and of like gathering in this month. I know a lot of LGBTQI+ people that are not comfortable with Pride, and I think that is completely understandable, and especially people that, like me, like I was born in 1995 at a period where I grew up identifying Pride with something, like with a party where everything is wonderful, colorful, there's a lot of glitter, there's a lot of nice things. Some years ago, I come from Spain, some years ago, critical Pride was created, which is something like, it's a counter celebration that tries to counteract all these tendencies that you were also referring to in terms of rainbow capitalism or pinkwashing of the movement, and trying to make Pride, going back to that initial grassroots, very much political vindication, apart from, celebrating and everything else. And I think it's a very complex situation to be in as someone that maybe, feels that they belong to that group, because of course it's a wonderful moment to feel community and to gather and celebrate and occupy public space, which is always a good thing if you can do it. But then you're occupying a public space in which, especially, it has become so big, that you have to have armed forces that are controlling that nothing gets out of hand. So it's always those full of contrasts that are like showing you that, it's a moment of celebration and vindication, but it has limits, right? And there's the latent threat that is there. And that entails a certain degree of assimilation to a system that you don't support as well. So it's an ongoing problematic relationship. But yeah, I don't know. What do you think, Benno, about it? Because I think I don't have definite answers.
Me neither. But I recall we had a conference 2 weeks ago, Intimately Material, and one of the speakers there shared a picture from Gaza with an Israeli soldier holding a rainbow flag, and kind of the message was kind of bringing Pride back to Gaza. And you think like, yeah, that's not what I want to celebrate. And kind of, when you talked about the armed forces and kind of the security that kind of surrounds, encircles those big events that Pride parades can be nowadays, right? I really think of smaller groups where, as you say, kind of people really needed those events to practice becoming visible as a group as kind of gay, lesbian, trans people in public. And I think for me is the core, actually. And what do you say about the diversification? I mean, I come from Berlin, or kind of my queer life is primarily in Berlin. And I don't know, in some years there's kind of 5, 6, 7 different demonstrations, parades. There's an anarchist, there is kind of a libertarian, there is a transgeniale pride, and then that's what they call the mainstream pride. And I remember kind of I was there when one of the big pride parades, Judith Butler declined the prize she was going to be given, and she declined it because she said kind of this event is also kind of very racist, and kind of the organizers of this big pride parade do not do enough in order to kind of support anti-racist struggles. And that for me was a strong moment. Also kind of difficult to navigate in several respects. But I think this diversification of demonstrations and parades is exactly important right now, right? Because kind of there is different struggles that need to be fought. So there need to be different arenas where people can kind of make those claims and put forward those demands. And I think that's very much where we are right now.
If I can just say, it's super true, and I think something similar as well happens with the feminist movement, even if that's another topic. It's important to have different arenas, but it's also important that they acknowledge each other and that are, you know, also in collaboration and maybe like, you know, hand in hand with each other, because of course for any political struggle, fragmentation is a problem, right? And I think moments of pride where it's also a show of force, you know, it's like a show of, like, to everyone else, it's a show of saying, here we are, we're here, we exist, we're many, we can occupy space and we make some noise. And I think that spirit, of course, people that go to Pride will not identify with the use of homonationalism for, you know, the killing of people that are also queer, even if they're Palestinian, for example, which is what happens in Palestine right now, and it's terrible. No one will identify with that use of pride that sadly is very much embedded in how we see the month, especially right now. But I think it's also an important moment of acknowledging intersectionality as much as we can, but trying to also think about a commonality as well within that. I think that's important as well to preserve the political impetus that it needs, because if not, I mean, look at Italy. It's just receding and receding as well. It's just, it's important, I think.
Yeah, I thought about that Giuseppe, when you talked about things that go the wrong way, kind of the decision that kind of last year to kind of basically take kids away from their lesbian mothers.
Exactly.
Right? So it's in places where, in all kinds of places, kind of we are experiencing these drawbacks, to say the least. And if we look into countries kind of outside of Europe or at the fringes of Europe, if you look at Russia, for example, Iran, Kenya, I think for me the most important thing there is to really listen to what activists in those places say, what they want, right? Because it shouldn't be like we do something to help them, but kind of the help is, in the first place, is to listen and not to think there is no activism in those places. There is activism. And that we should support them in the way they want. And the second thing is to also think about migration politics. Politics around asylum, right? Because kind of it's not that kind of all European countries are happily receiving refugees, people who have to leave the places where they live because of their gender identity or their sexual orientation. And I think there's a lot of work to be done there as well. And I think, as you say, Pride is also an opportunity to kind of talk about these issues.
These were very rich questions, and as you said, it's very complex. Also, at the same time, I was thinking how, again, intersectionality plays a role, and privilege play a role in these discussions and conversations. So, as you were saying before, you have homonationalist tendencies. So, LGBTQIA plus people and rights are used to promote actually colonial and discriminatory and violent practices on one hand. But under the banner of, yes, we are supporting LGBTQIA plus people, where at the end it's not really the case, not necessarily, or they are exploited in a way. And at the same time you have migration policies that are maybe from the same countries who promote homonationalisms. At the same time they also block people from entering crossing borders and entering countries because they're not, the right type of person that could fit into their society, the right type of model. And I'm thinking, for example, of even at the Ukraine war, where trans people were blocked. They couldn't really cross the border because their identity card didn't match with their gender identity. So just to make an example. So yes, it's very complex, and it made me think also of the Pride marches that I loved most. So I have to say they were the ones who were a little bit more, let's say, less sparkly, maybe a little bit smaller, but in small cities where they also they're also starting to think about spaces for people who don't want to be touched or be surrounded by crowds, and so there are some white spaces where people can enjoy more the parade in silence, or with more silence, and not be bothered too much, or more accessible routes for people with disabilities or special needs. And so I think that goes back to what you were saying about listening to all the different groups and all the different needs of the community, really. And it's difficult, but I think in some ways we are getting there. There is still a lot of work to do.
I'm just saying, because listeners don't see Monica and myself. We've done a lot of nodding, kind of listening to us.
Yes. Preach.
Yes, there is a lot of nodding going on within a few months. I'd say, well, now I'd like to ask you a more personal question. So do you have a pride that you love more than others, or some, I don't know, LGBTQIA plus milestones that you feel closer to you or to your story? If you want to share these with our listeners, don't be shy.
Prides I haven't been to, but I've read about. So there's now a recent initiative in Germany called Dorf Pride, like village pride. And that's very much, kind of where I come from. I mean, the village without the pride, but kind of I think it's good to see that there's more and more kind of also in small places, not the millions, not the thousands in Berlin or New York, but kind of in smaller places, smaller parades, demonstrations. And the other one is kind of the gay shame parades. I've never been, but that was an initiative that kind of explicitly kind of criticized this kind of celebratory character. And I think, if I remember correctly, they were giving out prizes to the most exploitative gay businesses. Nice. The kind of the gay shame award. So I mean, these are the things that come to my mind. There's more kind of stories about Pride experiences, but kind of, I can't share everything here.
A lot of happens in Pride. I would go back to the critical Pride that is going on in places like Madrid, which is where I come from, and it's a city that is very, very conservative in terms of politics, but has built this idea of like extremely queer friendly city, which it is. Critical Pride kind of started to bring out those incongruencies of saying, okay, there's a conservative party giving us the license to do this, and then why, under which conditions, what does it say, and how does it affect what happens in the rest of the year. So I think critical Pride for me is a very important moment. And I think that another thing I would thinking about like smaller initiatives, there's also some initiatives that, because I think it's important, and one thing that is criticized in Pride a lot as well is that it's just one moment a year, and then the rest of the year a lot of people don't talk about it, right? This podcast runs through other moments, no? But how many podcasts do like one Pride episode and then never talk about queer stuff again? And there's some initiatives that I know, for example, in the north of Spain, where my family comes from, in a very small village. Now that you say that, there's a bit like, in July, there's this big party, which is right after Pride, which they made on purpose so that it doesn't collide with Pride. But it's like this big party organized by a queer folkloric performer that went to live to this super small village that has 50 inhabitants, all over the age of 75. And once a year, he just organizes a huge party there with a lot of queer people, like queer performers, and these people from this village that are completely foreign to all this culture and to a lot of like ways of life that are represented during those days are just there and take part in everything and in the organization. And there's this like beautiful mix of different people that come from different places, different ages, and it's kind of this beautiful continuation of Pride that I think I even like more
Wow, I want to go.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful.
Tell us when it is. I'll book a flight. Thank you for sharing this. I was also thinking that we could talk a little bit more about the UI, and of course last year was the first time we participated as an institution to Pride, and there were some debates even around our participation and how we participated. So even within the UI we have these debates around what kind of representation we want to show in terms of supporting the LGBTQIA plus community at the Institute. Is this just performative, or is this more substantial? So I think this is very productive, and there is some work to do, and we're seeking to do it, but we'll try to do it again this year when we will participate at Toscana Pride in September. And but also on top of Pride, and the initiatives that the Institute is organizing, let's say more formally, there are a lot of things going on organized mainly by our researchers and our staff, trainees, all sort of professors, all sort of people who are part of our community. So I think it would be important to talk a little bit more about it, and maybe we can tell our listeners what's going on at the Institute for June.
Yeah, I have so many things are going on, especially on one day. They just concentrated everything on the 7th of June, which probably has already passed by the time this airs. But so a big group of researchers and also some trainees are also, especially from the library, have been also involved in this program. That started with a queer book fest at Badia. And then because during this day there's this celebration at EUI called Coppa Babone, which is a football tournament that can be very masculine and straight. They decided to queer it a bit by doing some teach-ins about both queer teach-ins from what it means to what is happening in terms of queer and LGBTQI plus AI plus people at EUI, and also how that is related to other student-led grassroots initiatives related to especially Palestine, the encampment that just went on the last couple of weeks in Italy, in Florence, and it is still going on in other places of Italy. So they just do this really nice connection between that and pinkwashing and homo nationalism, and then how all that affects our lives here today and how they are being talked about and worked through at EUI. Then there's also the intersectional pride statement that was also done last year by the researchers and has been done this year. So a lot of things are going on that day. Then there's the collaboration to go to the, as you said, to the Pride, Toscana Pride together. And then there's also a lot of continuing work that is done throughout the year by people gathered, especially under the umbrella of the union. If anyone of EUI is listening to this, which I assume most of the listeners are from EUI, they can also go to the website of the union. There's a lot of useful information for queer people and things that are available at EUI, but also that could be improved at EUI, and they can it's meant to start a conversation, to be a work in progress, very kind of organic. And then there's also working groups that talk about queer and LGBTQI plus stuff, like the Queer and Feminist Studies Working Group, to which we both belong to. Try to bring these conversations into academic work and into the classrooms that we have at EUI. A lot of stuff being done, and a lot of stuff that should can be done. So.
And continues to be done, right?
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, and it's spread out across the year, right? There's Trans Awareness Week, where we usually do an event in November. There is Women's History Month in March.
LGBTQ History Month Italia, which we
which is in April.
Oh yeah, it's LGBTQ History Month Italia, which we collaborate with as well.
Which is in April, so kind of I think it never stops, and that's good. Because we also need to continue thinking, for example, about EDI at the EUI. I think we're in a moment in the history of the institution where it's not quite clear kind of how we as kind of a community will move forward with questions around equality, diversity and inclusion. That's important. Also the whole discussion about sexual harassment and kind of how we address that problem. I think that's also an ongoing discussion. So yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's good to have this moment in June to reflect and celebrate. There's nothing wrong with celebrating. But it's also important to kind of remind ourselves that there's work ahead.
Yeah.
Definitely, and I think some steps have been taken in terms of introducing gender toilets, for example, in our villas, or reviewing our sexual harassment procedures, or even organizing events like Pride. But of course, there is still more and more things to be done in terms of trans inclusion, and for example, looking at our at the way same-sex partners are treated. At the Institute, if there are some gaps that should be filled, and I think it's there is momentum, and I think it's there is still time to have conversations around not only LGBTQIA plus inclusion, but as you were saying, Benno, in terms of where the Institute wants to go in terms of EDI. So I think we'll have some new developments in the next months regarding this. I was also thinking in terms of initiatives that and it links with the meaning of Pride and what can stem from Pride, sometimes unexpectedly. So at the Institute, the participation of at Pride last year in Florence galvanized many members of staff who for the first time felt they were able to speak about these issues, and this led some members of staff to wanting to organize something more structured in terms of a network regarding LGBTQIA plus issues. And so I think at the State of the Staff, which is I think on the 18th of June, you will see the launch of this initiative coming from staff members, but it will be open, of course, to everyone at the UI. So there is a lot of going on. Yes.
Exciting.
That's exciting. And I think I'd like to close with a couple of questions. So one maybe, again, is a complex one. So we could go on for hours.
We love complex questions.
I know you love complex questions. So I was thinking about, we are talking about our university, our institute, but in terms of the role that academic institutions can play in promoting LGBTQIA plus rights or inclusion more broadly, do you think academic institutions have a role to play in this perspective, and what role really, if any?
Shall I? Do you want to start?
Please start.
Well, first of all, they do have a role to play, academic institutions. It is, well, one is reflection, accompanying kind of contemporary developments, also kind of enriching them, kind of as a historian, I can say that, by looking back and kind of, think about how people have been otherwise in the past. I think that continues to be important. For that reason, I'm particularly happy that intersectional history will be the main research theme of the history department in the year ahead. That is important, but then it's also, I really think it's important to have conversations, right? Because there are different modes of engaging with queer issues and topics, kind of, and they should remain different. Academics have a particular take on things, and activists have a other kind of way of approaching things, and sometimes we're academics as well as activists, and then sometimes it gets a bit complicated. But I think it's for me probably the most important thing is having those conversations across, and I think that's also why for us it's so important to kind of be in contact and in conversation with organizations like Non Una Di Menos or kind of Intersectioni, or kind of to kind of really also look for opportunities to kind of share what we think and do with what other groups and organizations and movements are doing. Then to see kind of how we can join forces. And I think that's, for me, really the most important thing.
Yeah, I completely agree. And also maybe on the other hand, it's also super important for universities to keep on supporting queer people and queer researchers, and try to make them feel welcome in institutions, try to feel the doors be open so that they actually apply, they come here, they feel comfortable, and they can also produce research that in many instances is also related to queer history or queer studies. and that is not, very taken for granted in institutions that are historically very, straight, heteronormative. It's important to create spaces where they can produce research that then feeds into the activist movements, and that kind of disrupts a lot of research that is very traditional and normative, that has been very often used as justification for discrimination. So it's both sides, I think, and I think the UI can work on both, and it's important.
Great. So disrupting alliances, I think it's kind of, if you can sum up in 2 words, but no, thank you. That was very, very, very interesting. And but our time is running out, so I have just a final lighter question. So that's something we ask all our guests. So if you have any books, podcasts, songs, movies to recommend to our listeners that are linked with the topic of our podcast today, with Pride, or recommend something different entirely. But if you have any recommendations.
I'll go first, because I think your list is longer. I thought, because we were talking about Pride, I thought about the film Pride, about the lesbians and gays support minors. Which, when you talked about that small village and how they organized that festival there, I thought about that kind of London queer group going to that Welsh mining village. And I still think it's a great film. And, oh my God, music, don't get me started. I'll just mention one, Out, Stephen Grossman. Song from the 1970s, which I think kind of brings across that complexity of how in those early days of Pride, the main problem was overcoming fear, and I think that's what we should continue to do, overcoming our own fears, but also help others to overcome theirs.
I will just recommend one person. He's called, it's an artist called Lineker, and she's a wonderful Brazilian trans woman that is a multifaceted artist that does music and has also done super interesting work on TV and cinema. And I would just recommend anyone to watch and listen to anything this person has to say and do, because her voice is not normal, and it talks a lot about the political aspect of being trans in a society, like the Brazilian one nowadays, which is also really, really powerful and really beautiful.
Thanks. You will find the links, I'm saying for our listeners, you will find the links to all these different resources on our YouTube channel, where you can find our podcast. So stay tuned, because for the special episode, Andrea Lee and Christina Pasanicolaki went around the UI interviewing EY people, asking them questions about what Pride means to them and many other things. And thank you, Monica. Thank you, Benno. That was a great conversation. And I'll see you at the Pride next Bye, I'd say.
Thanks, Giuseppe, Christina, and Andrea, and to everybody listening.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having us. It was a pleasure.
Pride. What it means to me is that you're able in society to express joy, happiness, love in whatever way you feel you deem acceptable, or where you feel like truly yourself. And of course, because there are certain people that do not get to do that in society as often as they would wish because of prevalent social norms, Pride is about those expressions, or at least to me, those expressions of one's identity that are often marginalized or not given a space or a place in social life.
How do you show your pride year-round? One important thing that we can all do is to keep informed, to stay updated with the news, to fight for LGBTQ+ rights always. And one thing that I do specifically is I watch RuPaul Drag Race all year round.
Pride has always been something that I have experienced and enjoyed since my childhood. It is a place where many of my friends have been, and myself, been able to express our own identities in a thoughtful and safe space.
I feel like the Pride is an opportunity to everyone to be themselves. Also, is a very good opportunity to give support to take a position in this matter.
We are here all year round, and we cannot be taken out like this just one time to show diversity. EY should make more work for diversity, inclusivity every day of the year for everyone.
Who is a historical LGBT figure you admire and why?
I think that the person I admire most from the LGBTQIA history is Harvey Milk, which was a social and political activist in San Francisco who was assassinated by a homophobic person during the 1980s, during the AIDS pandemic. And he basically was one of the key Californian leaders of the LGBT community. He was basically able to unite a divided community and to mobilize it in favor of equal rights, freedom, and more importantly, solidarity.
Pride events going forward need to not only teach the history of queer people and queer liberation, but also focus on events that are currently happening and realize that there is no pride unless everyone is liberated, because queer liberation is liberation for all. For example, some regimes, like what Israel does in Palestine during Pride Month, in pink washing and showcasing that if you do not have LGBTQ rights, then you are automatically bound to be under occupation. This narrative must be changed, and we must all realize that there is no pride in genocide. And this is when the events that we are holding here at the EUI are so important, because we make sure to include these stories in our events and highlight them for everyone to see.